Welcome, ghouls, ghosts, mere mortals, to the Hidden Creek Manor. Now, over the summer, I bought a second projector. I'm going to stack my two projectors and project the same image on the house with both of them to brighten the image. The problem is, the enclosure that I had for my projector previously was only big enough for the one projector. So now I need to build a whole new enclosure with enough space for both projectors and enough space to circulate air throughout the whole enclosure so that way it doesn't overheat. So on this episode, we're going to build a new projector enclosure that's weatherproof and can hold both the projectors with some extra space for air circulation. So let's get started. Alright, so let's go over the supplies that you'll need for this build. I used one sheet of 4x8 half-inch ground contact plywood. I used 4 24-inch half-inch threaded rods. I used 24 half-inch nuts and washers. I used some weather stripping, one piece of 20-inch by 30-inch clear acrylic sheet. I used 4 computer fans. I got a couple of hinges and a locking mechanism, some caulk, and 3 cans of matte black spray paint. So the first thing I did was measure out and cut the top and bottom pieces of the enclosure. The enclosure is 24 inches by 18 inches by 18 inches. For the top and the bottom, I measured out 24 inches by 18 inches, and then I went ahead and cut those pieces out. And then after cutting the pieces, I went ahead and labeled them so that way I would know what I'm dealing with. All the wood that I'm using in this build is very similar in size, so I really wanted to make sure that I labeled it so I knew exactly which piece I was working on. As we get further into the build, I even would put a little arrow in which direction that it should face, so that way it just helped out when it came time to assembling everything. Next step was to measure out the 2 middle pieces, the pieces that the projector will actually be sitting on. Now I wanted to make sure that these were slightly smaller than the top and the bottom, just to make sure that I had enough room for not only the side pieces of the enclosure to go in, but also to make sure that they weren't going all the way to the front and the back. So I made these 17 inches long and about 17.5 inches wide, like I said, just to make sure that they fit and that there's no friction. So now that I cut the side pieces, I'm going to go ahead and cut some air vents in the bottom of them. So I went ahead and put the projector in the middle of one of the pieces and then kind of marked out where the projector feet were. This doesn't have to be exact. Just want to make sure that the air vents don't get in the way of the projector feet and cause issues later on. So now that I've mapped out where the projector feet will go, it's time to go ahead and map out the vents. So these are just 1/2 inch wide, I think about 5 inches long, just to make sure that there is enough airflow in the projector housing to keep it from overheating. I was originally going to try to use my router for this, but I didn't have the right bit. So instead of that, what I decided to do was just cut a 1/2 inch hole at the top and the bottom, just using my drill. And then after drilling those holes at the top and the bottom, I got out my Sawzall and just cut in between them. Now, it doesn't have to be pretty. No one's really going to see this. It's really just to make sure that we get that air flowing. So my cuts weren't precise, but that's okay. So now that we cut out the vents, it's time to cut the holes for the metal rods, so that way the 2 middle pieces in the projector housing can move up and down freely from each corner. Something that I ran into previously with the old projector enclosure was that if I needed to move, say, just the left foot up, I didn't really have a way of doing that other than by putting shims or other items underneath it. So now what I'm going to do is have these metal rods going through the pieces that the projectors are going to be sitting on,
And then I'm going to use the nuts and washers so that way I can adjust them as needed for independent corners, and that way it'll make it much easier to aim the projectors properly at the house. So I just want to make sure that those metal rods fit through the holes no problem, which as you can see they slide right through, which is what we want. And now I'm going to drill a hole for the wires to go through. So I just want to mark out where I want to drill that hole, and then I'll take my drill with a bit large enough to allow for the power cord to fit through. And I'm going to do that at not just the bottom piece, but also those two middle pieces as well. So that way I can feed wires from section to section. Now that I've got all those holes drilled, it's time to go ahead and just do a light sanding to get rid of all those extra little pieces of wood that can cause issues later on. Then after using my sander, I decided to just get out a piece of sandpaper to get in between the vent holes and then also the power cord holes, just to make sure that we get all that cleaned up as well. So now that we got the top and the bottom and the side pieces cut, and then even added the holes for circulation and power cords, now it's time to cut the side pieces. So now that the side pieces are cut, it's time to go ahead and attach the top and the bottom to the sides. Pretty straightforward with this one. I just added some wood glue to the bottom and the top of the side pieces, and then I would screw in the top and bottom piece to the sides. Now, one issue I did come across is that with these being just half-inch pieces of plywood, drilling a screw into the middle of it would often cause the wood to split. Even if I pre-drilled my holes, I was still having some issues with that once the screw went in, and I'm using just standard wood screws for this. So what you didn't see on camera was I went back and redid the top. And when I redid the top, I cut two pieces of I just cut a 2x4, the spare 2x4 that I had. I cut two pieces to go on either side on the top, so that way I could drill both the side pieces into that 2x4 and then also the top into the 2x4, and I eliminated that splitting that was happening with the plywood. So now that the plywood is cut and glued together and screwed together, it's time to go ahead and put those metal rods in here. This wasn't hard, but it took forever because I had to, well, first off, figure out how many nuts and washers I needed to go within each section between pieces of wood, and then I'd have to take the nut and washer and screw it pretty much all the way to the top of the metal. So I'll save you guys the heartache of having to watch me doing this for 10 to 15 minutes straight, and we'll just fast forward through the rest of this. So now that the metal rods are in place and the middle pieces have been attached as well, it's time to start drilling the holes on the side pieces for the fans, so that way we can circulate air through the entire system. Now, because of that 2x4 that I added, it did cause a little bit of an issue on the top level. So I wasn't able to use quite as big of a hole for the airflow as I wanted to, but that's okay. At least we have a hole, and I'm gonna have that fan blowing towards the hole, blowing air out on one side, and then blowing air in on the other. So for the top level, like I said, I've used that smaller bit, and then for the bottom I was able to use a much larger one. And then once again, now that we've drilled those holes, it's time to get the sander out and get rid of all those splinters. So with everything assembled and the holes drilled, it's time to start caulking. I had a little bit of a leakage there, but just gonna tell you guys this, I am not the best at caulking things. That is the bane of my existence at times, so you guys can probably see here, I don't know what I'm doing. I know the concept, but I'm not very good at it, so I just went ahead and caulked along all the lines where the wood connects, and then once I got done running the caulk, I would just run over it with my finger to kind of get rid of all the excess caulk and the extra bits and pieces here and there. And after letting that caulk dry, it's time to spray paint. So I end up using 3 cans of matte black spray paint on the entire build. And I mean, spray paint is spray paint. You pretty much just do a coat, let it dry, do a second coat, let it dry, just keep going until you have the full coverage that you need. So once the paint dried, it was time to go ahead and put the weather stripping on the back of the projector housing. So with this enclosure, I am going to have a door that opens and closes on the back. The previous projector enclosure that I built, I put the hinges at the top, so the top would open and close. The only problem with that was it would move the projector enclosure slightly, and often move it just enough where the projection didn't map up on the house properly. So I'm hoping that by putting it on the back, that will solve that issue. But because it's on the back, I would want to make sure that there's no room for water to leak in. So I'm putting this weather stripping on there, so that way, instead of just 2 pieces of wood attaching to each other, it's going to have that extra padding with that weather strip. Now, I had this weather stripping laying around the house, or in my workshop, I should say. I thought I had enough for this entire build. I was wrong. So you guys will see here, I only did the top and about half of each side, and then had to run to the hardware store later on to get the rest. So you don't see that on film, but I did eventually complete the weather stripping on this. And with the weather stripping in place, it was time to go ahead and put the hinges and the locking mechanism on that door. So I just kind of measured out to make sure the hinges would be even. And then same thing, I made sure that locking mechanism was kind of halfway in the middle. And just went ahead and screwed everything in place. Once I got it all in place, I placed the board where it needed to go on the projector enclosure, and then just attached the hinges to the enclosure itself, and then eventually put that lock piece on the other side. I didn't get that on camera, and I don't know why. But anyway, you don't see it here, but eventually there was a piece added there that would allow us to actually lock the enclosure. So we're almost at the end. Now it's time to start putting the fans in place. So these are just standard computer fans I bought from Amazon. I'll put a link in the description. They come in a pack of 2, and the reason I went with these is that, well, not only do they come in a pack of 2, which is nice, but also they come with a standard just AC adapter, so you can plug it in directly into your standard outlet. You don't have to use a USB. And when they come pre-packaged like this, they're all ready to go. But for my needs, I had to kind of take them apart and put them back together again with some longer screws. I needed to be able to attach them to the side of the projector enclosure. So I dismantled them and then just took some drywall screws and just put it back together again using those drywall screws. And then once I had the fan put back together, it was time to just attach it to the projector housing. Now, something that else I didn't get on camera that I changed later on, I initially put these in, and there was a bit of a gap because I had the too long of screws, so I had to get some shorter screws between the side of the projector housing and the fan itself. But also, I mounted them a little bit too close to the sections where the projector would be sitting, and I wanted to make sure that I have enough room so I can move those up and down. That's the whole reason that I went with that whole system that I did. So I just moved them up a little bit higher off camera, and then also, like I said, put in those shorter screws so it made it all the way to the hole and it didn't leave that gap. Now for the top, it's a little different. That 2x4 that I added for structural stability got in the way of the fans, so I was not able to go all the way to the edge. Now I guess I could have drilled a hole in the 2x4, but I just didn't feel like doing that. The fan's still going to serve its purpose even if there is a small gap between the hole and the fan itself. So I figured this isn't going to be the worst thing in the world if it doesn't go all the way to the hole. And with that, the fans are in place. And now it's time to put the clear plastic piece on, which is really the last part of the build. So I have this 20 by 30 piece of acrylic or plexiglass basically. It does have a plastic sheet on either side of it to protect it. I'm just extra careful with this one. I just want to make sure that I don't break this because it's not cheap, you know, for this acrylic plastic. I want to make sure that I don't ruin it. I have to go buy another sheet. So before I started cutting, well, first I measured the sizes that I needed. Then I put a piece of painter's tape over my measurements. Then I measured a second time and then put my line over the painter's tape. And this way I'm eliminating any chance that whenever I start to cut this, it will break and, like I said, ruin that piece of acrylic and have to buy a new one. And then I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do this. In the past, I would kind of score it with a knife and then bend it until it breaks. You could try using a saw. Then you also run the risk of it breaking as well. So I decided my best approach would just be to use my Dremel tool. I could just kind of start off slowly, just making a slight indentation into it, and I could go a little bit deeper until eventually I make my way through it. And it took some time, but I didn't have to worry about splintering pieces of plastic and breakage or anything like that. And then after I cut it, I did do a light sanding by hand, just to get rid of any sharp edges. And then it was time to put it in place. So I set it on top of the enclosure and exactly where it needs to be. And then I took some E6000 adhesive. Now, I'm sure you could use other types of glue, whether it be hot glue or super glue or whatever you might need. But in my case, I used E6000. I knew it would hold. It stands up to the weather and does a great job. One other thing that I did off camera was I eventually put some clear caulk around the piece of plastic as well, just to make sure that nothing leaks in between the plastic and the wood and gets into that projector enclosure. And at this point, the enclosure is complete. So let's take a look at the final results. Now I mounted my projector housing to a 4x4 that is then attached to a stake in the ground, so that way it's in the same spot every year whenever I put on my shows, whether it be Halloween or Christmas. I could even use it for other holidays. I just only use it for Halloween and Christmas right now. But also that way it also stays consistent, so I can actually work on my shows throughout the year on my computer, and then whenever it's time to actually do the setup, I don't have to make any changes.
So that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you want to stay up to date and notified with everything that we're doing here at Hidden Creek Manor, consider subscribing to the channel. Happy hunting, and we'll see you in the next one.
Congratulations, you made it to the end of the video. As a reward for sticking around, you may now watch one of these two videos. The choice is yours, but choose wisely.